police crime museums all over Europe, there are items of evidence that have brought some of the world's worst criminals to justice. Behind every object in these black museums is a fascinating and sometimes macabre story. Though the female of the species is commonly regarded as the gentler sex, a look at some of the classic murders of the past reveals that, though perhaps less prolific, women are capable of executing both violent and ingenious crimes. At the heart of Europe, in Belgium's historic city of Liège, our first case took place in the 1930s. It concerned a middle-aged widow named Marie Becker, who was eventually found guilty of murdering 11 people and attempting to murder many more. The case of the Veuve Becker, the widow Becker, is one that captivated the Belgian people at the time. Proving Marie Becker's guilt entailed meticulous work by Belgian forensic toxicologists who pioneered a new method for detecting a most uncommon poison in human remains. For Marie Becker's murder weapon was digitalis, an extract from the foxglove plant, known for its medicinal use for heart conditions. She secretly administered the poison in cups of tea and dainty cakes.
Poisoning, it's a very deceitful thing. You're not shooting someone in the face. You're not facing your enemy. You just get rid of someone without the person noticing it. People were shocked because she was a woman. She was the symbol of danger all of a sudden. The fallen angel, basically.
Marie Becker gave no indication that she would become one of Belgium's most notorious criminals. From humble origins, her life until middle age was apparently unexceptional. She was a dutiful wife, and she worked as a bookkeeper in the family firm. When her husband died, his death was given as natural causes, although later people would suggest that she was responsible. At the time, though, there was no cause to suspect her.
Je connais Madame Becker.
I knew Madame Becker. She used to come to my parents' grocery store, and I'd carry her shopping to her house. She was very nice. She was helpful with people. If somebody needed her services, she was always ready to oblige.
Marie Becker relied on her charm to win the confidence of vulnerable women, often befriending them in tea shops. She might explain that she was looking for lodgings, and usually she would be invited to stay. If there looked like substantial wealth to be had, somehow Becker would quickly appear as the sole beneficiary on the woman's will. Becker's first official victim was also close to home. Before her husband's death, Becker had become good friends with a couple by the name of Castadeau. The couple had lived in the Becker home since 1929, and it was an unusual arrangement. Though Becker and Monsieur Castadeau were probably lovers, she also enjoyed a close friendship with Madame Castadeau. At some point, however, Madame Castadeau became ill with terrible vomiting. The illness began after drinking tea prepared by Becker, a bitter brew that Madame Castadeau had commented on. The general consensus was that Madame Castadeau had suffered from heart trouble, and her death was attributed to natural causes. But if Becker had hoped to marry Castadeau on his wife's death, those hopes were quickly dashed when she found him in the arms of another woman. Still, undeterred, she swiftly became engaged to another man, a Monsieur Lambert Beyer. Beyer lent Marie enough money for her to live on, but the relationship was short-lived. Beyer died unexpectedly on the 2nd of November, 1934. Marie had been nursing him, with chamomile teas, she said, after he had complained of sickness. But she showed no grief at all when he died. In fact, she seemed to flourish. Suddenly, the previously penny-pinching widow was spending money like water. Shortly after Beyer's death, Marie Becker took a lover many years her junior. She turned to crime to support their lavish lifestyle, and it was at this point that Becker's friends and acquaintances started to die with alarming regularity. In the summer of 1935, Marie Becker was arrested after the police received anonymous letters raising suspicions about these deaths.
Despite all the tests that were carried out, there was never any conclusive evidence of poisoning. My father, the examining magistrate, was furious about this discharge, as he was convinced that she was guilty. But before freeing her, he told her, "Madame, I am releasing you because the judicial authorities have decided so, but don't ever fall back into my claws, because I'll never let you go again."
But Becker did not heed this warning. In the spring of 1936, another widow, a Madame Cruel, died after displaying the usual symptoms of sickness and vomiting, and after having supposedly named Becker as the sole beneficiary of her will.
Marie Becker thought she would get away with it. And it is very common for people who are serial killers. They always think that they are more powerful than justice. And I'm afraid that Marie Becker got too much self-confidence.
Following Widow Cruel's death, another 3 women died in quick succession. Marie Stewart, Marie Bult, and Florence Long, all with the same familiar symptoms. Some days after the death of Madame Long, Becker dined with her friend, Madame Weiss. On the following day, Weiss was found dead. Promissory notes were discovered showing that Weiss had loaned Becker a large amount of money, which was never traced.
The widow Becker was watched daily by the police, and she was rearrested on the 12th of October 1936. They found digitalis in her handbag. My father, who had had to release her the first time, could now detain her until she appeared in the Court of Assizes. Digitalis has a regulatory effect on the cardiac rhythm of the heart, but if too great a dose is given, the heart reacts too strongly, and death follows. The important point is that digitalis is given to people with heart problems. Marie Becker lived a normal life. She used to dance, rather well, actually. And the fact that she had digitalis in her bag, that was not normal.
My father knew the Becker family since his childhood. He lived in the same street. Though only 31 years old, my father was already considered as a very good young lawyer. He wasn't afraid.
Monsieur Chevalier agreed to defend Marie Becker for no fee. Becker's defense rested on her statement that she'd actually obtained the digitalis, 17 bottles in all, for a mysterious Dutch friend, a Madame Domer. Becker described Domer as a beautiful woman who had helped her out with money, and to whom, therefore, Becker owed a debt of gratitude. Newspapers printed her name in the hope that she would come forward, but all to no avail. The prosecution declared that she did not exist. Becker's defense seemed very slim.
She had lied all the time. The best example was in the Domans case. She told the interrogators that Madame Domans and herself always used to dine in the same restaurant, at the same table. It transpired that she had never been seen there, and the table she had pointed out had always been occupied by a priest.
Becker's hard-pressed defense concentrated on the scientific evidence concerning digitalis poisoning, stating that the symptoms of the women could have been attributed to other ailments such as indigestion or angina. But the prosecution was eventually able to prove that one of the women, Madame Long, had indeed died from digitalis poisoning.
The experts took organ samples from the putrefied bodies and injected them into frogs. Then observed the symptoms on the heart. They then took some ordinary digitalis and injected that into the frogs and compared the symptoms. In both cases they found the same symptoms. So they were able to conclude that digitalis was present in the putrefied organs that had been extracted during the autopsies.
The fatal dose of digitalis is 2 grams. Madame Long had taken ill and died in a matter of 24 hours. And the amount of digitalis remaining in her stomach was significant, over 10 milligrams, far exceeding a medicinal dose. Numerous relatives of the deceased came forward to speak of the sinister way Becker had isolated the women before their deaths, excluding the families. Becker's defense claimed that the press had played a huge part in vilifying her, creating a kind of mass hysteria around the case. It must have come as no surprise to the people of Belgium, therefore, when Marie Becker was found guilty of poisoning 11 people and attempting to poison 5 more. Becker was sentenced to death, but this sentence, in accordance with Belgian law, was then immediately commuted to life imprisonment.
Le cas Becker.
The Becker case is an historic case. I was taught during my medical studies by Professor Moreau, who had worked on the case. And I myself, in my own teaching, gave the Becker case as a good example of new research into new poisons which couldn't be detected by the standard procedures of the time.
Marie Becker died in prison, aged 62, in May 1942.
You expect to be protected when you get into the domestic sphere. I think that Marie Becker's deeds proved that you're not safe at home either.
There's always some frisson of surprise and interest when a murderer is found to be a woman. But when the murder involves a child, the female killer is all but demonized. Our story begins in 1934 in the Scottish city of Aberdeen. At 1:30 p.m., 8-year-old Helen Priestley had finished her lunch and was about to leave her tenement home in Urquhart Road for afternoon school when her mother asked her to run and fetch a loaf of bread from the shop just up the road. Helen bought the bread for her mother, but though she was seen to leave the shop holding the loaf, the little girl never made it home. Soon the whole of Urquhart Road knew of Helen's disappearance.
I was born and brought up in 61 Urquhart Road. I knew Helen Priestley very well. I got home at 5:20 and hell had broke loose. Helen was missing. And then the panic set in and everybody was running head and tail.
All the men, mostly men and the young teenage lads and things, they went searching for her. Whenever she went missing. And there was hundreds of volunteers looking for that child.
The police made an inspection of Helen's home and the communal areas of the tenement block, but found nothing. Helen's father, John Priestley, was amongst the volunteers that combed the streets and allotments that spread out from Urquhart Road.
Some went west, some went south. We went through the cricket pitches. It got so dark, in fact it got wet. And they gave up till the next day. But the next day wasn't required because Helen's body had been found.
The little body lay wrapped in a sack inside a small recess near the communal lavatory on the ground floor of a tenement building that had been her home. The shock of the discovery by a family friend was compounded by the fact that it appeared that she had been violently sexually abused. When her mother, hearing that something was going on, came down the stairs and saw her daughter, her anguished cries filled the building. Frederick Joss, who lived across the landing from Helen's family in the tenement in Urquhart Road, recalls the tension during that time.
Oh, the atmosphere was very severe. And they questioned everybody in the house. They even followed me to my work.
Meanwhile, the post-mortem was being carried out. It produced some unexpected results.
There were bruises around the voice box and the windpipe. There was vomit in the airways, and the conclusion was that death was due to strangulation. When the sexual organs were examined, they found there were some very brutal injuries caused by an object about 1 inch in diameter. But when they tested for semen, no semen was present. And it was concluded that someone had injured her to make it look like a rape.
Helen Priestley had not necessarily been murdered by a man. 8 families lived at 61 Urquhart Road, and after detailed questioning, all were found to have cast-iron alibis, except Jeannie Donald and her husband, who lived with their only daughter in the ground-floor flat directly beneath the Priestleys.
Helen Priestley and Mrs. Donald's Jeannie, her daughter, all played together on the street. Both the girls were always fighting, Jeannie and Helen. Helen kept kicking at Mrs. Donald's door. She kept rattling the railings down the staircase just to annoy them. So there was a lot of animosity there.
Mr. Donald had not joined in the search for Helen, and whilst most of Aberdeen roamed the streets looking for her, the couple were watching their daughter in a dancing competition. The questioning of the couple went on for hours, and by evening the detectives had also made a thorough search of their flat. They found a large bloodstain on the floorboards, and though they had no evidence that it was human blood, they arrested Alex Donald and his wife Jeannie on suspicion of murder. Jeannie Donald stated clearly, "I did not do that." Aberdeen was electric with the news that an arrest had been made, and crowds who had witnessed the police coming and going from Urquhart Road all day now packed the street.
The Black Maria couldn't even get through the crowds. They were so bad, and they were rocking the van and, battering it with sticks. It was so bad.
From the partially digested food in Helen Priestley's stomach, the time of death was estimated to have been between 1:30 and 2:30 in the afternoon, when Alex Donald had been at work. Jeannie Donald was left to face the charge of murder alone.
We just couldn't believe it. To think it should have been so kind to all his children, and she had already committed a murder.
Oh, the mobs were in the 61 Urquhart Road for days after. And some of them was just coming down to look at the murder house. You see, that's what it was called. 61 Urquhart Road, the murder house.
The eminent forensic pathologist Sidney Smith was brought onto the case, and as the scientists began their work, the evidence against Jeannie Donald grew. Firstly, Smith analysed the sack in which Helen Priestley's body had been found. It had the word "boss" printed on it, and had a hole in the right-hand top corner. Identical sacks were found in Jeannie Donald's flat. She stored her potatoes in them. Each had a hole in the top right-hand corner, where she hung them on a hook. But it was what was inside the sack that interested Sidney Smith. When Helen's body had been discovered, cinders were found in her hair and between her lips. Inside the sack, Smith now discovered a handful of washed cinders, as well as human and animal hair and fibres. In the tenement block, Jeannie Donald was known to be the only housewife who carefully washed off the ash from cinders that would, for economy, be reused on the fire. The human hair inside the sack also proved of interest. It was definitely not Helen's hair. It was coarse and waved as if by an artificial perm. When compared with hair taken from Jeannie Donald's head, Smith found them indistinguishable. A loaf of bread found in the Donald flat also became a piece of evidence. It was a type of bread known as a plain loaf, the sort that Helen Priestley had been sent to buy on the day of her death. Jeannie Donald never bought this sort, preferring a French loaf. Smith needed harder evidence than this. He turned his attention to the wounds that Helen had received in the simulated rape. Could the rupture of her intestinal canal have led to her blood being contaminated by bacteria?
Working with a professor of bacteriology, Smith found that there was some bacterial contamination, and when they examined the bacteria, they found there was one really unusual bacteria, one that the professor had never seen before. They did isolate this particular bacteria from the washcloths found in the house. The linking of an unusual bacteria from the body to a washcloth found at the scene was extremely sophisticated scientific work at that time.
Whilst none of the evidence from the Donald flat was in itself conclusive, altogether, Smith's work totaled a staggering 253 separate pieces of evidence. Even the defense would concede that this was impressive. The atmosphere was charged with tension when the jury returned. Their verdict could almost be read on their white, drawn faces. It was unanimous, guilty. Immediately, Mrs. Donald collapsed. The judge, Lord Aitchison, was deeply moved by the situation, and with the black cap on his head, he pronounced the death sentence in a voice which was lowered by his emotions to a scarcely audible whisper. Jeannie Donald would be the first woman to be hanged in Scotland in modern times. On the 3rd of August, an appeal was lodged, and at the 11th hour her sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. Jeannie Donald, a model prisoner by all accounts, was released in 1947 after serving 13 years. The mystery of why and how she killed Helen Priestley is still a matter for speculation.
According to the neighbours, Helen was a very irritating child, and you can imagine that on this particular day, Mrs. Donald flung open the door and grabbed the girl and shaken her out of annoyance, and suddenly she'd fallen unconscious, and Mrs. Donald may have thought she'd killed her.
It was discovered at post-mortem that Helen Priestley had an enlarged thymus gland, a gland that's in the chest, and so she suffered from a condition called status lymphaticus. And it was believed at that time that this condition would predispose someone to collapsing or dying if they're exposed to violent exercise or a shock.
Perhaps having something thrust up inside her, the poor child woke up and started to scream. According to Sidney Smith, he thought that Jeannie Donald had tried to stop her screaming by putting her hands round her throat. Jeannie Donald made a statement to the police that they'd woken up in the night and one of them had made a cup of tea at about 2:30. Perhaps during that cup of tea, Mrs. Donald confessed to her husband that the dead child was under the sink, and I think she must have persuaded her poor husband, after presumably horrified reaction from him, to take the body out and put it by the closet. So they must have been creeping about all night, doing grisly deeds.
Mrs. Donald wasn't a vindictive person. She was a very, very nice person. And I just think she snapped.
She never meant to kill her, I'm sure. And yet, the injuries were so violent. It's extraordinary.
In the Becker and Donald cases, the sex of the murderer was almost more significant than the facts of the murders. Two women who, through very different crimes, showed people what they didn't want to believe, that men certainly don't have a monopoly on violence.
Detectives on the murder trail next often put work before their health. We join the hunt for Angelo Buono and Kenneth Bianchi, the Hillside Stranglers, next.